All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. It's just at 2 o'clock, and we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Krista Egger, and I lead our Green Communities work at Enterprise. We are all gathered here today to discuss how to create green affordable housing with the New York City Overlay of the 2020 Enterprise Green Communities criteria, a green building program designed for the affordable housing sector with a long track record of use in New York City. So during today's session, we're going to discuss critical components of the 2020 overlay, significant changes as compared to the 2015 version, and we'll discuss the new HPD Pre-Approval process. So before we get started, I'll share a little bit of info about logistics with you. As you all know, we're using Zoom today, and if you're experiencing any difficulties with connectivity, like hearing us or seeing us, the first thing I'd ask you to do is to try to close other windows and browsers you might have open on your computer. And then if that doesn't solve your problem, please just chat us in the chat box. We have a stellar team behind the scenes today who's here to ensure that you have a good experience. Gabby Morris-Flores will be helping you out. So don't be shy and please chat if you have any issues. We are recording today's session, and we'll post that for you to share with your colleagues within about a week. So if you have to step away for a few minutes from today's session, don't fear, you'll be able to get the content in about a week in a recording format. And then finally, I'd like to share my appreciation for my two co-presenters today, Shelby ONeil with Enterprise Green Communities and Jen Leone with HPD. So the three of us will be guiding you through today's session. And because we do hope to use the chat feature a good deal today and see what questions you have and direct you to resources and new information, we're going to start with just a basic warm-up question so you can get comfortable using the chat box, which you should be able to see on the bottom of your screen. So really easy chat prompt to start us out this morning. And that chat prompt is going to be, where are you working from today? So I'm going to type that in. And I'll answer myself by saying my kitchen table. So if everybody could just type into the chat box where you're working from today so we can get a little bit of a feel of everybody in the room, even though we're not in person, that would be great. Awesome. Got a lot coming in now, from homes to offices, living rooms, dining tables, kitchen table, field office, couch, lots of couches. A door on two sawhorses. We've got Connecticut, different parts of New York. Awesome. Great. Well, thanks for sharing out a little bit today. And remember where that chat box is, and we hope to see your questions and answers and comments in there soon. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and share some slides. And please remember that you can still use the chat box even if the slides are up. So to orient us all, today is the first session of 4 of a summer series that we're having about the New York City Overlay. Today's session is going to be focused on the introduction and an overview of the overlay. Here on your screen, you should see the titles of the other workshops we'll have in this series. Use the same logon Zoom information for each of them. So if you've registered once, you can use that for all of them. Next Wednesday, we'll dive deep into success with integrative design in the new criteria, and we'll be joined by an expert from the Mayor's Office of Resiliency to talk through how we're using the Climate Resiliency Design Guidelines exposure screening tool as part of the overlay. In 2 weeks, we'll dive deep into the solar requirements and be joined by HPD and Solar One to talk through those. And then the last session, 3 weeks from now, we'll focus in on the building performance standards And we'll be joined by Alyssa Knight from the Mayor's Office of Sustainability to talk about how those relate to Local Law 97 in the city. So thanks for joining us today, and we hope that you can join us for other sessions as well. For today's workshop, here are the three main workshop outcomes that we're aiming for. We're going to be reviewing the goals and process of developing the overlay, the key components of the HPD protocol, and then how to succeed with the technical content of the overlay at a high level. As far as agenda goes, I'll share with you all a little bit about developing the overlay in terms of goals, process, and results, then turn it over to Jen to talk through the HPD protocol, then turn it over to Shelby to talk through the details of the overlay. And we'll have time for questions in between each of these transitions, and also time at the end for questions as well. So with that, I will reorient you all to about a year ago when we were starting to create the New York City overlay. At about this time last year, we were just wrapping up the first draft of the national 2020 criteria, putting it out for public comment. And we came to New York and had several listening sessions to get feedback on the national content. And started to get glimmers of what we wanted the New York City overlay to look like. And the three goals you see here on your screen are the goals that we had for the overlay. Number one, we wanted to make sure that the overlay reflected assumptions of projects built in New York City by eliminating documentation requirements for you all that you don't need to submit, because we can just reasonably assume that all projects, by virtue of being in New York City, can meet. The second goal was to provide New York City specific resources for different criteria. So the overlay could be a backbone for you all with links to different local laws and programmatic requirements of building affordable housing in the city. So a guidepost or backbone for you all to navigate those. So it isn't just an additional requirement, it's linked to the other items. And then thirdly, to identify new or additional requirements applicable to projects in the city. So for the process, you all may see yourselves in the pictures here, or you may remember having joined us at some of the listening sessions where we were looking for your feedback about what items to prioritize, what items to deprioritize, what resources from other entities in New York City should we link to the criteria. After coming in July for some feedback sessions in the city, we then put the first draft of the national criteria out for public comment. And then we came back to New York in September with several listening sessions to focus in on how should we create the overlay. Then in October, we released a version of the overlay for public comment that hundreds of you all commented on. And then we revised it in collaboration with HPD and released another version, another draft of the overlay in January at the same time that we released the final national 2020 criteria. So you could see the full criteria in the context of the overlay. And then in April, we finished the overlay by incorporating your feedback from the second feedback session as well. In terms of how we went about achieving the results that we initially set out to achieve, you can see here on this slide, I've just put the numbers of 9 different criteria, which we've eliminated documentation requirements for projects in New York, given that you're meeting these as of right. For the second goal of providing New York City specific resources for the criteria, I don't expect you all to be able to read all of the text in blue on your screen right now, but I do expect you to recognize some items here. These are all of the New York City specific items, resources that we've incorporated into the 2020 overlay of the criteria. And then finally, you can see on your screen here the additional requirements that are applicable to New York City that are incorporated into the overlay above and beyond what projects in other parts of the country will be following. So you see that there are 7 criteria numbers highlighted here that are required for New York that are optional elsewhere. And 3 of them, 5.3b, 7.6, and 7.9 are highlighted because they're both brand new to the Green Communities criteria and required for the city. And Shelby will touch on these later. And then you see about 8 criteria that have new options for New York City projects to follow that are optional. So with that, you know, the overlay was created and launched on our website. And if you've explored it a little bit already, you'll have recognized that projects in New York that are rehabs will be required to follow the mandatory criteria and get at least 55 optional points, whereas new construction projects in New York will be required to earn at least 60 points. And these point thresholds are higher than required by other projects in other parts of the country because we are counting the points that you will automatically be earning without providing documentation for because of your location in the city. So I'm now going to take down these slides after giving that overview of the goals, the process, and the outcomes of developing the overlay. And now I'm actually going to share with you the overlay itself. So what you should be able to see on your screen right now is our website that is for the criteria. And I'm going to put in the chat box a link for you if you'd like to visit this yourself. So in the chat box, you should be able to see a web link for the criteria site. And I'd like to orient you to a few different things. So over on the right-hand side of your screen, if you watch that, as I scroll down, you'll see this navigation bar. And you can filter which criteria you'd like to see. So if you're new construction, you can click that button, or substantial rehab or mod rehab. And then if you have urban clicked below, you'll be able to click this box for project will follow New York City overlay. And by making those selections, the criteria will now have filtered out the ones that you don't need to bother with and will include the items that are included in the overlay. And if you'd like to see the full text of some criterion, you can click under here. For instance, if I click on integrative design, I'll be brought to that section. And you can see with criterion 1.1, you have the New York City overlay information clearly spelled out here in front of the nationally relevant rationale and requirements, recommendations, and resources. So take a look at that if you'd like. If you'd like a shorter version, you can click on checklist, and you'll be able to see 3 versions of the checklist that you can choose to review. There's an Excel version, which you can use, download to your desktop, edit points around, and see how you're doing with compliance. You can look at a PDF version, or you can use this interactive version that's farther down on your screen, where you can select yes or no and type in points with the different criterion, which you'll see tallied for you over here on the side. So we've looked at where to find the main criteria, we've looked at the checklist, and then I'd like to draw your attention to a few other things. So if you scroll down on this navigation bar and go to appendices, that's where you'll see the definitions for substantial rehab and mod rehab. If you go to addenda and FAQ, that's where we'll be populating the addenda and FAQ over time. We don't have any yet that are applicable to New York. And then if you scroll down even farther, one second for this tech issue. Okay, you'll be able to click on NYC Overlay, where then you'll be able to see the same checklist that we looked at a second ago, as well as a link to the HPD protocol. And then finally, if you click on templates for certification, these are the documents that you'll use to submit with your certification application. The first one is instruction, and then the others are templates. Most of these templates here are applicable for all projects, no matter where you are in the country. for certifying to green communities, but there are a few here that are applicable just for New York City projects, like this one here, the CRDG exposure screening tool. So with that, I've given you a highlight about how to navigate this site, and I'd encourage you to go ahead and click your filters on the screen here to match the type of projects you work on most frequently, if you'd like to follow along for the rest of the presentation. So I'm going to stop sharing. And Shelby, are there any questions that have come in so far in the chat that we should address before handing it off to Jen?
None at this time, just enthusiasm for the filter tool.
Okay. Yeah, I'm so glad that we put the criteria online, especially when we're all working from home these days. It's actually nice to be able to show you the criteria in real time rather than page through a PDF. So all right. With that, I'll hand it over to Jen, the Chief Sustainability Officer with HPD, to walk us through how you actually work with and communicate with HPD when you're working on submitting your Green Communities application.
So, hi everybody. Thank you for the intro. I think a good amount of you already know me. There's a lot of people from HPD joining as well. Let me just pop this on here. Can everyone see my screen okay? So great. We at HPD, and not just me, but all of us at HPD are really excited to start moving into the 2020 New York City Overlay. It's super relevant for our projects to start meeting, these higher standards, especially given everything that's going on in the city. We're really excited that the new 2020 Overlay really looks much more closely at resident health, as well as energy and carbon and so on. So we hope that people really start thinking about the 2020 criteria, because it's, needs to be used for all of our new projects. So anyway, let me talk a little bit about how the protocol is going to work. And if anybody has any questions, please, put it on the chat and we can go through it. So first things first, and this is really important, everything is on the HPD website sustainability page. And this is really important because this is where we will keep all of our most up-to-date forms. As you know, sometimes forms need to change for some reason or another. And we just want everybody to remember that's the go-to place. Please don't save forms onto your own server and start using old forms. It happens, and it's, it's challenging. So not just our forms are on our website, but, instructions, references, links back to Enterprise Green website, and so on. And you'll see that we've got the 2020 overlay instructions here, as well as for projects. This will be taken off fairly soon, but for 2015 as well. And we also have links to our solar where feasible page. For those of you, this will be covered in session 3. I won't go into that right now, but pretty much everything you need to know will be on our website. So now jumping into protocol, I've got to somehow move all of my screen so I can see this. Okay, so things are a little bit different than they were for the 2015 overlay. A couple of reasons for that. We at HPD are really starting to beef up our data collection. We need to start collecting more information to align with our benchmarking requirement, which most of you know about. So let me walk through our kind of 5-step process and protocol. So first thing, and this is not specifically part of Enterprise Green, but it is definitely related, is this builds intake form. So a few people have heard of this already, and this will roll out with 2015. I mean, with the 2020 overlay, or possibly before. This is a new form that teams will be required to fill in. And this just tracks buildings, mechanical systems, and certification, and so on. It's very similar to what you're already doing in the Enterprise Green portal. And this will be a database for us that we're really excited about and help us also assess projects. So that'll happen early on in the project. There'll be pre-populated forms sent to the development teams to fill out. And that is sort of part of the initial build submission. You'll see that there's questions about sustainability, but also questions from the builds team. At some point after that, there is a new requirement, a new paperwork requirement that ties into our solar where feasible mandate. And again, I think a lot of people are familiar with this. The 2-second intro is that local laws 92 and 94, which came live in New York City this past November, require green roofs or solar on all new roofs for all buildings in the city. But HPD projects were excluded until 2024. We thought that was a real lost opportunity, so we now have a solar where feasible mandate attached to all of our Enterprise Green and LEED projects. So one of the first steps in the Enterprise Green sequence is to do a solar feasibility analysis. And it's basically a roof plan, a form, and a tool that helps teams determine whether solar is in fact feasible for their projects. I won't go into any more depth than that right now, but this form is required. It will get submitted to us at HPD and will be reviewed. And this form, if it's got to be signed by me or by somebody at HPD if I ever get staff. And that will be a requirement to move on to the next step. And the form will say, yes, this project has solar, great, or no, this project is waived for any one of several reasons, or we need more information. And we'd like to see those early on in the project cycle. Step 3, this is where things become much more familiar. This is the Enterprise Green pre-build authorization. We've renamed it because it's always been very confusing. This is the step everybody's done for 2015, where you submit a package of documentation to HPD. We review it, make sure it's all there. And only after this form is signed by HPD can you move on to the Enterprise Green pre-build approval process. Again, not that different, but there's a few additional pieces of information we'll be requesting. And I'll get to that in a second. Next step, project closing. So you know what, my timeline information is on the next page. Typically, projects have gotten their pre-build approval from Enterprise Green, although often it's a conditional approval. We are now requiring a final official pre-build approval that is a requirement for closing the project and getting the financing to kick off the construction. And this is really important because stuff is sort of getting lost in the works. And finally, I'm not going to walk through Enterprise Green's construction sequence and all of that, but when you get to the end of the project and it's time for conversion, we will be tracking post-build certifications more rigorously than we have in the past. And we want to see those documents and we'll require them as a condition of project conversion. So I'm going to skip over to the next page. And there's just a little bit more information on here in terms of when these steps are due. And I'm just going to walk through that again to review it. The builds, that intake form is, at the beginning of the builds design consultation or design review. That's where that form gets kicked off, probably gets modified a few times throughout the process as things change. Solar feasibility analysis, that can be done right away. That's the optimal time to start assessing a roof's solar potential. We understand that's not always possible. So we want to see that certainly before the pre-build authorization process. The pre-build authorization process, we'd like to see this at the end of schematic design when there's enough information to let HPD know what your intentions are, but not so late that it's, you know, it's too late to make effective changes to the design to be, you know, have a higher performance levels or achieve more. And we'd like to see them also not at the very end, scrambling right before closing, although we know that sometimes happens. Couple pieces here to cover. What we'll be collecting for the pre-build authorization is a little more in depth than in the past. We will want to see an updated intake form. And again, it's a fillable PDF. It's not very challenging, but we want to see an updated form that gives me and my team more information about the project that we don't usually have such easy access to. We'd like to see a thumbnail rendering. It's much easier than going and looking at a full drawing set, just to have a good visual on what the project looks like. We'll be collecting the green consultant contracts. Again, we want to make sure that the contracts contain the scopes that we're looking to see. The CRDG risk exposure tool, again, it's a very simple worksheet, and that'll be covered next week in the session. An energy performance report, again, that'll be covered at some point during these presentations. A criteria user report, that's the Excel spreadsheet with all the points and information about which criteria are being utilized and where to find that information. This is not the checklist. It's not the simple PDF checklist from the enterprise website. Also, we want to see the signed solar approval form, and finally the pre-build authorization form, which is kind of just a checklist. Yes, I have all these items. Signed form required for the enterprise green pre-build process. The rest I've pretty much covered already. So I'm not going to go into too much depth on that. But this, I can make this flowchart available. I don't think it's currently anywhere accessible to anyone other than myself. I don't have that much else to talk about. We do, as Krista pointed out, this whole protocol it's on our website. It's on Enterprise Green's website, and it walks through the process in much greater detail. But a few things I want to point out is that we have HPD's definition of sub-rehab has been slightly modified, and that is on that protocol. It's just a little tighter of a definition, not substantially different than before, but everybody should take a look at that. What else? There's some, really nitty-gritty details in here that I'm not going to talk about. But lastly, one thing I want to point out is that we have file naming conventions listed on the protocol. It's very challenging when we get all kinds of documentation from teams with wacky project names. We can't find them ever. We can't identify projects. So I've given file naming conventions for everything. And the last thing I want to say is please make sure to give yourself enough time to go through the steps. They're a little bit different and a little bit new, and always put your HPD ID on everything, on the Enterprise Green portal, on all the forms, all the paperwork. We can't find your projects if we don't have that. So that is pretty much everything that I have. I can reshare the screen if I need to, or if anybody has questions. And I see that a few chat questions have come up.
Yeah, Jen, the first one that came through that maybe you could answer is, Camilla was asking for projects that are already in builds and are going the 2020 route, does this new build intake form still apply?
That's a really good question. And we'd love to try and collect that, but we don't even have the forms ready yet. So at some point, if we want teams to fill them out, we'll have the project manager reach out and say, hey, can you please do this? It's all information you have. It shouldn't be a huge burden.
Okay, great. And then the other question that had come in so far was, could you clarify who are the champions for the new documents? So who would you expect to complete and submit the builds intake, for instance, or the solar feasibility analysis?
Okay, that is also a really good question. The build intake is a development team kind of joint effort. There's a lot of questions that probably the architect will need to fill in. It's the information that they typically handle. This is not new to them. And then there are 2 pages that are limited to sustainability questions. We assume the development team will pass those on to the green consultants to fill them out. And the information on them it's all stuff like, is this certifying to Enterprise Green 2015 or 2020? Is it passive house? What are the mechanical systems? How are the projects being metered and so on? So hopefully it won't be that complicated. Solar feasibility form, again, we're asking that the development team does that, but we assume that it will be handed to the green consultant to fill out, unless there's somebody else like the architect who's doing the solar, designing the solar for the project.
Great. I've got 2 other questions for you before we turn it over to Shelby. One is in relation to these forms that you've been talking about. Let's see, are the forms filled out online and remain online, or do we download them and fill them out? If filled out online, can we save our work?
So we really wanted to have everything online and really super streamlined, but we could not make that happen. So everything is download, fill out, PDF. Okay.
And then 2 different people were asking questions that are similar, asking about timeline. So for instance, will projects that are already in builds and DOB review have to follow 2020 or be allowed to continue with 2015? Or is there a milestone in the design process beyond which it's impractical to switch from one to the other?
So yes, I can answer that. That we are asking all development teams to contact their project manager at HPD as soon as possible to discuss this. There are a lot of factors in here. We know that there are some cases where it simply doesn't make sense to switch over, but we also have very weird timelines right now. So that is a question they can answer, and there's not a sort of one-size-fits-all approach, other than we're really trying to have projects that are going to close in 2020. Certainly those can file under 2015. We're really hoping that projects beyond 2020 will use the 2020 criteria. That's our goal, wherever this is possible.
Great. And then one last question, and then we'll turn it over to Shelby. This question is about the Healthy Homes training and whether or not it would work the same way, and whether or not it would be possible to proceed with pre-build without a general contractor's Healthy Homes certificate, because the general contractor might not have been chosen by that.
Yes, so thank you from Camila Fernandez, who seems to be 100 people today, and it's super confusing. Yes, that is a huge issue and has been for a long time. Healthy Homes training will be similar to that in the past, although we're going to have 2 different sessions. The Healthy Homes that we're all familiar with, which is still valid, and a new training put on by the Mayor's Office of Sustainability and Resiliency. That's much more about high performance buildings and resiliency, which are 2 really huge key topics. So those will, for now, everything's online, until we can go live again, although the new training hasn't been finalized yet. As relates to the general contractor, one thing that I've been trying to work out is how we can have an online or digital component to make it easier for the general contractors to take the course, because what's often happening is it's slipping through the cracks because of the timing. So we'd love to have something that the contractors can do without having those weird scheduling conflicts, but that they're learning the kind of information that we want them to learn. So stay tuned for that. And the next question, the old Healthy Home. So what we're hoping is that teams will kind of rotate. If you've got a Healthy Home certification, it's still valid for 2 years. So if you did one last year, you don't have to do any trainings for 2 years. And then at that point, we hope you'll actually do the other training instead, and then that will be valid for 2 years. So the goal is, you know, that everybody does the both contents over, you know, a sort of 4-year cycle. Does that answer your question?
That's great. Thanks, Jen. Lots of great information. And just to reiterate, in the recording of this session that we'll be sharing out within the next week, it will include all the slides. So it'll include your timeline and flow charts. So that'll be accessible that way. We can also make sure to post those on our site if that would be helpful. But thanks for all of the information. I know it's just scratching the surface, but we're going to go ahead and turn it over to Shelby now to dive into some of the technical content. And then we'll wrap with a few minutes left in the session to answer a few more questions. But please, if you have questions, type them in the chat box and we'll try to respond in real time also. So over to you, Shelby.
Great. Thanks, Krista and Jen. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen now. And in the spirit of scratching the surface, I'm going to spend the next 15, 20 minutes or so at a high level talking about how to succeed with the 2020 overlay. But first, I'll introduce myself quickly. My name's Shelby ONeil. I help lead the certification program based out of DC, but today I'm calling in from Massachusetts. It's great to see familiar names and faces today, and hope you're all doing well. So thanks for joining. So I'll spend the next 20 minutes or so reviewing the 2020 overlay content, specifically focusing on the biggest changes from the 2015 to the 2020 overlay, how to set your projects up for success with the 2020 overlay, and where to find tools available to support teams through this transition, or sort of a reminder of some of the places that Krista walked us through. So just a quick note, the 8 categories that you're all familiar with from the 2015 criteria are generally the same, if not very similar to the 8 categories of the 2020 criteria. A couple of changes in name, for instance, water is now just water rather than water reduction or water conservation, because we're focusing on the quality of water in 2020. But essentially, at a very high level, I'll walk through the most significant criteria changes that are within these categories for you all to look out for in the 2020 overlay. And I will dive in, starting with category 1, integrative design. Specifically, our criteria 1.1 integrative design in the project priorities survey, which is new. New Yorkers know that the need for integrative design is only more critical in 2020 as the affordable housing industry in New York reaches for greater performance and greater health and resilience benefits for projects, all the while maintaining their limited project budgets and resources. Since we know that implementing an integrative design process can really determine the success of your projects, to help you all engage in a really meaningful integrative design approach, we're amplifying this process with a new comprehensive activity and tool, which is the project priorities survey. In a minute, I'll just pull up a snapshot of it so you can see it. Essentially, the project priority survey allows project teams to establish the context, population needs, and environmental considerations for your affordable housing project, but with a real focus on collaborative integrative design. I'll pull it up quickly here. Note that New York City teams are also required to let's see, I think I pulled that off. Also required as part of the project priority survey to complete a New York City climate resilience screening tool, which you'll learn more about from the Mayor's Office of Resilience. That's in lieu actually of completing one of the sections here with regard to resilience, but just a broad overview of this in-depth project survey that enables teams to really engage with populations served, residents, communities, and a whole number of in-depth examinations of a project site and surrounding community, as well as establishing a project mission. So back to slides quickly here. The project priority survey can be found actually in that PDF manual as part of that list of templates and tools that Krista shared on the website, and that links to our Enterprise Resource Center where you could go directly and find it as well. The intent today is not really to dive into the PPS because it's such a significant new tool. Our next session, I believe next week, is almost entirely devoted to integrative design and this tool, but encourage you to familiarize yourself with the project priorities survey, which is a bit of a tongue twister, and check it out in the interim. I'll go ahead and share a link so that you have it. I meant to do that while I was speaking so that folks could follow along. Sorry here. Great. Moving on, we'll get into our category 2 location and neighborhood fabric. I want to touch briefly on criterion 2.1, sensitive site protection. As we're aware, we're really living the increasing impacts of climate change, and it's urgent to conserve natural resources and protect ecosystems and reduce flooding, which may be sort of the key element here as we look at projects in New York City. The 2020 criteria and overlay now includes more specific requirements for limiting developments in these sensitive lands, and we're framing this work and this conversation to further encourage this habit when designing by designating these resources ecological resource protection zones, or these features rather, affectionately called ERPs. And the idea here is that if your site contains an ERPs, we'll ask you to follow the guidance and the criteria to submit a really accurate map illustrating these conditions. But if no ERPs is present on site, to comply with this criterion, you'll follow the same protocol of submitting a traditional site plan. Not a whole lot more to go into today on this one, but something to please look out for that's different in 2020. I'll quickly move on to criterion 215B, access to broadband connectivity. I want to just note this, of course, it's particularly called out in the overlay, and it's mandatory for certain projects. But originally this criterion was only available to rural projects and New York City overlay projects. We've made it available for optional points to enable access for residents over the country to have access to necessary services during the COVID pandemic we're experiencing. So do encourage teams to explore this one, both given the New York City priority to the extent you're able. I will move on to category 4, water. These guys you should be pretty well versed in from 2015. Criterion 4.1, water conserving fixtures, and 4.2, advanced water conservation. Essentially, the key change here is for both 4.1 and 4.2, we're focused on overall water reductions and aren't looking for specific flow rates other than that the appropriate fixtures are WaterSense labeled. We've gone ahead and updated our water template when documenting this criterion at pre-build, and there's just one template to demonstrate compliance for 4.2 and 4.1. So no need to do extra paperwork, given that New York's compliance with 4.2 covers the national requirement for 4.1. But go ahead and check out the new calculator on the website. Moving on to operating energy. And we'll start with our favorite at a very high level, our building performance standards that they're different in a number of ways. And before I launch into this, I just want to reiterate, I'm really speaking at a high level today, and in a few weeks, our last session, I think, is focused on operating energy and building performance in 2020. So please keep that in mind. But just for now, at a very high level, new construction projects follow 5.1a, and they must certify to Energy Star. There are 3 pathways in order to do that: ERI, ASHRAE, or the prescriptive pathway. 5.1b is our performance standard for rehab projects, and like before, there's a ERI or ASHRAE path, but we have different targets or threshold for both. And given these changes and a few more that we'll go into very detailed in a couple of weeks, wanted to call out that new templates are here to support the documentation of the new performance requirements. So actually, with the help of some of you maybe on the phone, and our team, specifically my colleague Lauren Westmoreland on the phone, we built a new comprehensive set of templates to enable ease of documentation for pre-build and post-build for all of these pieces, and some other Category 5 criteria that are really streamlined and I think going to help with the transaction of sharing performance information really well. One of the other criteria being criterion 5.3b, moving to zero energy, renewable energy. So calling this out, like the 2015, I guess, version, teams are encouraged to install renewable energy sources to meet a portion of a project's demand. As part of the 2020 overlay process, as Jen mentioned, there's also the solar approval form and process. And this is one of the criteria in which we've designed to align with local law 92 and 94 as one of the compliance pathways, but be sure to read the fine HPD print to understand, where your specific project fits in to the requirements. That's about it for Category 5. I'm plowing through. There's a lot here, and hope you'll be able to join us in 2 weeks to really get into the details. Let's see. So with that, I'll quickly move on to Category 6. Just one criterion I want to note here. It's not specifically called out on my slide. I apologize. Recycling storage, criterion 611. As of 2015, this one is still required. But now the allocation of space for collection of organics or cardboard or a future recycling stream is also required. And we're asking teams to document this really well on their plans. And there's a little more flexibility about where these locations can be in 2020. So be sure to check that one out. Moving on to healthy living environment, where there are a few things we want to focus on here, starting with the smoke-free policy. We're familiar with many projects that followed the 2015 version or similar criterion to this one, but this is generally new, and it's mandatory for most projects in New York City. And as you approach this requirement, be sure to review the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene's smoke-free housing resource, which is in the full criteria, because there's alignment here and a little more information on how to comply. Essentially, for the first time, we're requiring smoke-free common areas and dwelling units for certain project types. Moving on to mechanical ventilation. Just going to talk briefly because I know we're short on time here, but we all know it's vital for ensuring indoor air quality. And I think, you know, that's something we can all really appreciate now, how New Yorkers depended on their indoor spaces in the last 4 months. So similar in 2020 as with regard to deferring to the ASHRAE standards for local whole house and common area ventilation. But we're also now specifically asking teams to test and verify unit airflow and to document this at post-build. So that's a bit of a change. Just want to call out this next criterion, 7.9 construction pollution. It's brand new to the 2020 criteria and it's required and pretty straightforward here, but the intent is to really protect the health of men and women on site, which I know we're all mindful of. And one more sort of group of criterion to touch on is a number of criterion at the end of category 7, subsection that we've grouped as promoting health through design. This is not unique to the New York City overlay, but it's sort of a new way that we're navigating health and design. Some good news for New York City walk-ups is that that 2020 overlay doesn't necessitate that projects incorporate active design. So of these 3, 711 active design, 712 universal design, and 713 healing center design, we're offering strategies for teams to improve indoor health in these other ways. Teams must successfully complete one of these criteria for certification. Welcome to pursue more. The tip here, again, it's a common theme that we talk about, but is really to bring your architect in to discuss the design early, given the level of thought and design involved to create a successful, healthy design. So quick recap on that front. I've now gone through the high level overview of the biggest changes from 2015 to 2020 to orient you towards the 2020 overlay. But again, scratching the surface here and encourage you all to look at the resources that Krista shared, a couple sort of keys to success that we want to share out. The certification process shown here is really largely the same, but we recommend that you all start fresh and break 2015 habits. As Jen mentioned earlier, you know, put away your old saved version of templates and documents and letterhead and you know, come open-minded to engage with the new content because there are new processes that you'll be responding to, and we hope you'll be able to come at them with an open mind to succeed with the new 2020 overlay needs. Next quick point is, out of the thorough overlay development that Krista talked about came a lot of content. So this is a beefy overlay, and we know you're all brilliant, you know, New York overachievers. So here's an opportunity to really read up and get cozy with all the new pathways and opportunities to design for residents that we care about. And finally, as I've said on other topics, just as we encourage you to do in 2015, plan ahead. And in 2020, we know you'll be most successful if you really start early on in the design process. And part of that is getting familiar with that project priority survey, which I touched on. So go forth and have your integrative design conversations early. Finally, quick reminder of sort of 3 key areas to look for resources. That 2020 one-stop shop website for planning and collaborating, Krista shared, are all of the tools and references for the New York City overlay and the new fancy filter feature may be found. However, that's, again, planning and collaborating. The certification portal is now built out such that you can submit 2020 templates for New York City projects. So submitting projects still happens within the portal. And then our Green Communities website, we're still there using that platform to share updates for our program, and encourage you to stay in touch with us there. And finally, the cert box, if all else fails, and we know it won't, we're here for you during this transition. So I'll just type in our email into the chat box to make sure everyone has it, but don't hesitate to reach out to certification@enterprisecommunity.org. Maybe I'll just pause. I know we're winding down here. Krista, are there any questions we should address now?
Thanks, Shelby. Yeah, there are a couple of questions we haven't gotten to yet, but I think we're going to go ahead and wrap up and can answer those questions in a follow-up email when we share out the recording. So thanks everybody for typing in questions and engaging on the side while Shelby was going through the information. I'm going to go ahead and put a link in the chat box to an evaluation form that we would love you to complete. There are only about 5 questions, so it should be short and easy for you. But we'd really appreciate your feedback on this session as we are working towards planning the other 3 sections of this series. And Shelby, if you could go ahead and move to the slide that includes the recap of the overlay with the number of points that are required, that would be terrific. And would just like to recap that today we've discussed critical components of the overlay, significant changes as compared to 2015, and Jen's walkthrough of the new HPD protocol. So taken as a whole, these strategies can ensure that the homes y'all are developing are built to last, that are going to be healthy, will be efficient, will be resilient, and will be affordable for the long run. So we really appreciate your time today. We hope that you'll fill out that short evaluation, and we look forward to working with you throughout your next project. And I'd love for you all to join us with these next sessions and be on the lookout for some follow-up materials from today. So I think that'll do it for now. So thanks again, and we'll see you all next week.
Thanks, Chris.